Among the surviving artworks of the Carolingian period are small-scale sculpture. Most of these are book covers, but the first thing we're going to look at is a small-scale equestrian statue. Now, an equestrian statue is a statue of a person riding a horse. And of course, they were very familiar in Roman times. You would have your conquering general, very often the emperor, would have himself portrayed on horseback. So there was a long classical tradition of this. And this is certainly the classical influence on Carolingian art, which was very important. You remember we called it the Carolingian Renaissance. Now, there is a controversy about which emperor this was. Some people traditionally thought it was Charlemagne. Today, I think the opinion has tipped. They think it's later, that it's probably Charles the Bald, Charlemagne's grandson. In any case, it is a bronze equestrian statue, but it's very small. It's tabletop size. It's only about 9.5 inches high. But just the fact that they were casting bronze figural work in imitation of classical monuments is significant. Now, there were a couple of classical monuments that Charlemagne would have known, and presumably the artist who created this would have known. One of them was a bronze equestrian statue of Theodoric the Great, Theodoric, the king of the Ostrogoths. And he had that moved from Ravenna to Aachen. It no longer survives, so I can't show you a picture of it. But Theodoric was not only the king of the Goths, but essentially he was the ruler of Rome. And Charlemagne may have felt that this was a very important connection because Theodoric would have been the first Germanic ruler of Rome. And so now Charlemagne and his successors, Charles the Bald as well, they are from the Frankish kings, but they are now the emperors of the West. The surviving statue that would have influenced the Carolingian emperors is the very famous Roman equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, which of course dates from the 2nd century. Now, during the Middle Ages, they thought that this statue was a statue of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. This is the only surviving Roman bronze equestrian statue. All of the other bronze equestrian statues of Roman emperors had been melted down. I mean, they were pagan emperors, but this one was spared because they thought it was Constantine. So Carolingian emperors could have seen this work in Rome. And so this, in some senses, is a spiritual model, if you will, of the statue of Charlemagne or Charles the Bald. You'll notice that the pose is in some ways similar. They're both riding a horse. The horse has one leg up. In the case of Marcus Aurelius, they believe that there was once a statue of one of the foes of Rome, defeated under the hoof of the horse, and the emperor is stretching out his hand in clemency to show mercy to his fallen foe. We don't have that same. We'll talk about the differences shortly. Obviously, one of the great differences is that Marcus Aurelius is 11.5 feet high, while Charles the Bald is only 9.5 inches. So there was a great difference in the scale of these statues. The poses are slightly different as well. We said that Marcus Aurelius was shown as a victorious general. He was an emperor, a general, and a philosopher. And he has here showing himself as a merciful, victorious general with his hand out in the gesture of clemency. And of course, there used to be a statue of the fallen foe beneath the horse's feet, which does not survive. The Carolingian monarch, however, is not shown here conquering territories or as a victorious general specifically. He's dressed as an emperor. He's wearing his crown. He's wearing the cloak that is fastened on one side with a brooch. And he's holding in his hand the orb of the universe, the sphere that the Roman emperors also held to symbolize the fact that they were the emperors of the world. And so this shows the world dominance, and that the Carolingian emperor is now the new emperor of Rome. I told you that most of the surviving sculpture are book covers, and the quality is extremely high. And here is one of the examples from the early 9th century. I should mention that some of the book covers cover manuscripts that are of a later period. This is the cover of the Lindau Gospels, and it dates to about 810. It's made up of, on the front side, which is what we're looking at, we see 5 panels of ivory. Ivory, of course, being made from elephant tusks you're limited in the size. So you put a number of panels together. And as you can see, the central figure is a virgin and child beneath an archway, a very elaborately decorated archway. On either side is John the Baptist, shown here as an adult, although he was the cousin and traditionally about 6 months older, just slightly older than Christ. But here is shown as an adult, pointing to Christ. Christ is the Lamb of God, as John the Baptist named him. On the other side is Zacharias, who is a priest and is also John the Baptist's father. The central panel is an enthroned virgin and child, shown beneath an elaborately decorated archway. On either side, standing, is John the Baptist as an adult, and his father, Zacharias. Now, John the Baptist, of course, was the cousin of the Christ child. Yet here he is shown as an adult. He's gesturing toward Christ. It reminds us that the adult John the Baptist pointed out Christ and said, "Behold the Lamb of God." And then his father, Zacharias, was a priest. Above the 3 figures in the center, we have angels holding a roundel of the adult Christ holding a book and blessing. And then below, we have a nativity scene, and we'll take a closer look at both of those. This is a little less than 15 inches by 11 inches, and it is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Here's a close-up of the top part and the lower part, and you can see these angels flying, holding Christ in a roundel. They may remind you of images from the Barberini diptych, or even from sarcophagi. We have the 2 images from the top and the bottom. We have a roundel of Christ. Here is the beardless Christ with the nimmed halo, the halo with the cross in it. He is holding a book, presumably the Gospels, and blessing. And then we have the 2 angels holding him up, and you can see the angels have these fluttering draperies, which might remind you of classical Nike figures. They might remind you of the angels from the Barberini diptych. Or they might even remind you of angels from sarcophagi, early Christian sarcophagi. Below, we have a scene of the Nativity of Christ. You have Joseph seated in a pose that goes on for centuries, where he's leaning his head on his hand and his other hand is on the knee. Then you have Mary in a kind of Byzantine pose. In Byzantine art, she's often shown with this big poofy, it also reminds me of an air mattress, but it's a bed on which she gives birth to the Christ child. But in Byzantine art, you usually see Mary giving birth to the Christ child in a cave, the Grotto of the Nativity. And here is something that we see more often in later Northern art, is the stable, which of course is in the Bible. So she's showing them in a structure, which looks very much like something nicer than a stable. It's got beautiful columns, it's got tiled roof. So is it a reference both to the stable and perhaps to the idea of a temple or a place to worship Christ? There's a number of stories about the ox and the ass, and here you see the Christ child lying in the manger, being warmed with the breath of the ox and the ass. So even the animals are acknowledging the presence of the newborn Savior. And then to the far right, we see the Annunciation to the shepherds, the angel coming to the shepherds and telling them that the newborn Savior has come into the world and that they should go and visit him. One of the interesting things about this particular manuscript is it does remind us of Byzantine images. Here, the iconography of the enthroned Madonna, and in the Lindau Gospels we see, once again, Mary enthroned very frontally with this long oval face, the large halo behind her. The drapery folds, of course, seem to be much more convincing. They actually are three-dimensional, even if flattened in a shallow relief. I'm comparing it here to the Hagia Sophia Virgin and Child mosaic, which is slightly later in the 9th century. And also, of course, it was in Constantinople. No Western artist probably would have seen this image unless you had a Byzantine artist who was coming from the West. But remember, this type of image was copied over and over and over again. So they very well may have had manuscript or other ivory sources. Here we have examples of 6th century Byzantine ivories. The detail of John the Baptist from the Cathedra of Maximum from Ravenna. And of course, they could have seen that one. That was in Ravenna. And the other one, probably they would not have seen, but you can see there's a lot of similarities, is the Archangel Michael, which we've already talked about both of these in the context of ivories of the 6th century. So now let's look at the similarities. You can see in all three cases, the 9th century Lindau Gospels, the 6th century Cathedra Maximum, and the 6th century Archangel Michael, all of these figures are placed beneath these very elaborately decorated archways. The columns are elaborate, there's decoration in the arches. And we talked about the ambiguity of whether the figures were standing beneath or in front of the arches. That ambiguity is still there to a certain extent, although to my eye, it looks like with the Lindau Gospels, it's more convincing that they are standing in front of the archways, and the archways form a kind of frame and background. If you look at the drapery folds, you can see that there's very similar drapery folds to what we see with the Archangel Michael. Perhaps not quite as much understanding of anatomy, but certainly the figures can reach over themselves. The draperies are bunched in ways that define the fact that there is an abdomen, that there are thighs, and the feet are. I'm looking here at the feet of John the Baptist and comparing them to the feet of the Archangel Michael. The artist seems to have solved that problem of the big feet on the little stairs by doing away with the stairs and just having a flat surface. They do seem to dangle a little, but you can see the influence of this type of art. Although, as I said, they probably would never have seen this exact ivory of Saint Michael the Archangel. The back cover of the Lindau Gospels is not in the Victoria and Albert Museum, it's in the Vatican Library. It shows Christ in a kind of symbolic sense, Christ treading on the lion and the basilisk, which in this case are symbolic of evil, of the devil, and Christ is victorious over the forces of evil. He is flanked by the angels, and of course we've seen this before. Think of the Barberini diptych where you have soldiers on either side of the emperor. Here it is angels who are the honor guard, as it were, to Christ. Christ is the beardless youth with the nimmed halo. He's still holding the book, blessing. Above we have another example of the roundel. In this case it shows the cross of Christ held up by these two flying angels. And then below we see scenes of the Magi coming first to Herod and being told where the Christ child would be in Bethlehem, and then the adoration of the Magi, as the Magi pay their homage to an enthroned or seated Mary holding the Christ child. She's paying their homage to the Christ child, obviously. Not all of the Carolingian ivories are on manuscripts that are created during the Carolingian period. Sometimes these Carolingian ivories were reused. And so the manuscript here is an Ottonian manuscript from the early 11th century, but they have reused a crucifixion ivory from the Carolingian period, from probably about 870. The crucifixion ivory itself is about 11 by 5. As you can see, it is set into a framework of enamels, jewels, gold, and of course all of these would be mounted on a wooden background. This particular manuscript is the Pericopes of Henry or Heinrich II, and it is in the Staatsbibliothek in Munich. Let's look closer at the Carolingian ivory. It shows many, many scenes crowded together. You'll notice you have this beautiful sort of stylized acanthus leaf border. In fact, you have extra panels here that make up a larger border. And this is a Carolingian crucifixion scene. The crucifixion, we've talked about a little bit the crucifixion image before. The crucifixion was a very important image in Carolingian art. And it is during the Carolingian period that we see, for the first time, Christ suffering on the cross. You see both. You see Christ triumphant, but here you see Christ suffering. And remember that we said that our first examples that survive of this type of imagery seem to be from the Utrecht Psalter. And so here, another Carolingian work of art, this time in ivory. You can see Christ's side being pierced, the lance being a figure, presumably symbolic of the church, holding up a chalice to gather Christ's blood. And it reminds us perhaps of those Eucharistic controversies that were going around in the 9th century. What was the nature of the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist? Between the sun and the moon personified in a very classical way, you have the hand of God reaching out. And then you have angels flying above the crucified Lord. The holy women, presumably John, are huddled together on Christ's right, our left. You might notice the serpent that is twining around the bottom of the cross. Once again, this is a symbol of evil. Christ has conquered sin and death. And if you think back to the serpent who was Satan in the Garden of Eden and first tempted man, brought sin and death into the world. Here Christ has conquered over all of that. He is bringing the possibility of eternal life. He is conquering over sin. And so this is his victory over the great serpent, which is Satan. The serpent also is portrayed sometimes in other Carolingian crucifixions, although I don't think I have one that I'm showing you in this class. Then there's another level below, and you can see that there's a kind of ground line that separates the different scenes, and this makes us think that there may have been manuscript models for this. Okay, so right here in the center below the crucifixion we see the resurrection scene with the three Marys coming to the tomb. The angel is there to tell them that Christ has risen. And then we see this very, very elaborate tomb. It's 3-level, surmounted by the dome. Generally, of course, we've seen 2-level early Christian examples previously. Got an extra level. Down below is the opening of the tombs. At the time of the crucifixion, the veil of the temple was rendered. The tombs were broken over. There was a great earthquake. And so you see people seem to come out of their tombs, and some of them seem to be alive rather than just the opening up of the grave, almost a real kind of resurrection there. And we also see classical personifications, which we do see in Carolingian manuscripts as well. There is Gaia down on the lower right. the symbol of the earth, the personification of the earth. And then what appears to be a river god. He might represent something like the Jordan River, but quite possibly he could be ocean, representing both the water and the land of the earth, which Christ has dominion over, which is disturbed at the moment of the crucifixion. Now, I'm going to show you one that's not in the textbook because I think it really is very interesting and it illustrates a point. This is the Psalter of Charles the Bald, and you can see that there is a ivory in the center, and then it is surrounded by this kind of filigree gold work with jewels placed as crosses along the edge. And since parts of it is broken off, you can see the wooden mount below. This is in Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale. This is the scene of Nathan confronting David. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to show you this is because there is the same scene in the Utrecht Psalter. And so one of the ideas is that this ivory may have been based on the Utrecht Psalter, and then shows, of course, the influence of the Hovers Rem school. Another possibility is that they both derive from the same model. That there was another, maybe an early Christian manuscript that they have based their images on. In either case, you can see that there's certainly similarities. The composition is different. With the Utrecht Psalter, it's a horizontal composition. You have to sort of spread it out. But at the upper level, you have Nathan denouncing David. We'll explain that in a minute. And then at the lower level, you have his analogy, the story of the poor man and his ewe lamb. With the ivory, we have a vertical format. And so the two scenes are one above the other, and the figures are pushed together a bit more. There's not the empty space in between. I'm going to show you a detail so we can get a little closer and look at some of these scenes. First, I want to tell you the story. You probably have heard of David and Bathsheba. Bathsheba was the very beautiful wife of David's general Uriah. And Uriah was faithful to David, but David was not to Uriah. David saw Bathsheba bathing. He fell in lust with her, and he had sex with her. And then he found out she was pregnant. And of course, the general, who had been out on campaign, he could not have fathered a child by Bathsheba. When he got back and found his wife pregnant, he would know that she was unfaithful. So what were they going to do about it? What David did was horrifying. First thing he did was bring back Uriah and tried to get Uriah to have sex with his wife. But Uriah was very faithful to his duties and didn't. And so what David did was send Uriah out with orders to go to the front of the battlefield. He sent Uriah out to be killed on the battlefield. And so what you see here are David in the center. On the ivory, he's standing under a gabled roof. Bathsheba is behind him, underneath another portico. She's under. She seemed to have just be coming out or going into a barrel vaulted chamber, probably indicating that this is a palace in the Utrecht Psalter. So they're both under architectural settings. And then you have the figure of Nathan, the prophet. And Nathan in the Utrecht Psalter is this very dynamic figure. He's leaning forward. He has the large hand coming out to gesture. And you can see he's very agitated. Nathan in the ivory has a somewhat different stance. His belly, he's leaning with his belly. He's sort of leaning back, but he does have large gestures and is obviously focused on David. Now, we see this gesture in other Carolingian artwork. So is this from another source? Is it just the way the artist wanted to portray it here? It's his own idea, or is it from a common source that the Utrecht Psalter has changed the pose of Nathan? Don't know. In either case, they're very lively poses. Now, what Nathan does is he confronts the king. And he confronts the king about this terrible sin that he has committed. Adultery and murder, really. You could say judicial murder. The king can do anything he wants. Now, there is the body of Uriah lying at their feet. He didn't kill Uriah right there, but he's brought in to remind us of what the sin was. And you might also notice that there are these indentations, these incised curving lines in the ivory that are somewhat different, but perhaps the ivory carver's rendition of the little mounds and hills that are made with the sketchy line in the Utrecht Psalter. Well, Nathan denounces David over this sin, and he makes an analogy. And the analogy is that what he has done is as though a rich man who had countless flocks, who could have, any sheep he wanted, went to the poor man. And the poor man had only one ewe lamb, whom he loved. And he took the poor man's ewe lamb and left the poor man with nothing. Of course, David had gone more further. He'd actually killed, or had Uriah killed. And the king is confronted with this. He does penance. He doesn't give up Bathsheba, though. I've always noticed this. But he asks God for forgiveness. He acknowledges his great sin. And so this becomes a story of even the highest king in the land sinning and then repenting. The book covers weren't all ivories. They had golden book covers. Codex aureus is the Latin phrase that's often used. This is the Lindau Gospel cover. It is in the United States. It's in the Morgan Library in New York City. It's manuscript 1. And it is, as you can see, covered with jewels and gems for the border and then within the design itself. It is a crucifixion image. It shows you Christ on the cross in the center. So we want to look closer at that. The technique that is used to create these images is called repoussoir. And basically you have a fairly thin piece of metal, in this case gold, and gold of course is soft, so you can do this, and you press from behind. And you push up your image and make a relief sculpture that way. And then of course you can come from the front and put in some of the details, for example, the details of the folds on the loincloth. So now I'm going to show you some details, but first let me point out where some of the things are. You have Christ on the cross in the center. Above him you have the image of the sun and the moon. And then you have these little figures that seem to be flying above the jewel work in the center. The angels above the cross, and below we see some of the figures who were with Christ at the crucifixion. So let's look at some of the details. I might mention that when you're photographing gold, you can get all sorts of different shades and colors. So of course the yellow tone isn't quite the same here. You can see the images of the sun and the moon. We can recognize the moon because she's wearing the crescent in her head. And as we said, this is very frequent in Carolingian crucifixions. And there are textual references. I could go into it, but I'm probably getting too detailed there. Christ erect on the cross, wearing the loincloth. His head is up. He is vertical. So he is shown as Christ triumphant over sin and death. We said in the Carolingian period, they have both the Christ triumphant and the Christ who is suffering. Then above Christ, you have these gems, a little circular pattern, and you have the angels. And when we look at these angels, you'll see they have the little fluttery draperies, the kind of tubular bodies, sometimes the hunched over bodies. They remind us very much of the kind of images we see in manuscripts from the Rheims school, like the Utrecht Psalter or the Lindau Gospels. And so it has been suggested that either this was created at Rheims or else it was influenced by Rheims. And there are various places that they say that this may have been created. And I don't want to get into all the arguments because they're long and technical. You might want to look at the gems. They did not cut gems in facets at this time. They would polish them, and then they would mount them on something that would raise them up so that they would catch the light. We talked about Byzantine mosaics as having this kind of flickering light. The light shone off the glass. Well, here the light is shining off the gold and the jewels, once again to make just a beautiful heavenly kind of image and experience. And here are the figures below the cross. And in this case, they're specific figures. We have Mary, the mother, with her hand to her cheek in a gesture of sorrow. John is wringing his hands, and you can see the little fold of drapery that comes out and balances the feet on the other side. And then below we have two of the holy women, perhaps Mary Magdalene, perhaps the other two Marys. The back cover of the Lindau Gospel covers is another example of using a earlier work of art as an earlier, probably book cover. This one would have been made in the late 8th century rather than in the, so almost about 100 years before the front cover. And it is silver gilt, enamel, gems. It has some little figural images of Christ repeated in the cross, very stylized, and all of these interlaced designs. So this possibly is an insular book cover, or artists from Britain, Ireland, or the British Isles could have made this. We don't know. Another thing that they would use, their very high level of metalworking skills, would be for reliquaries. Reliquaries are a container for relics. And a relic is sacred remains. They could be, for example, a bone or a part of the body of a saint. Or they could be an object that would be associated with the saint, say a piece of cloth that the saint had worn. This particular reliquary, known as the Enger Reliquary, dates from the early 9th century. And reliquaries come in different sizes. They have to be containers. This one is what is known as a Burse reliquary. It's the purse-shaped reliquary with the images of lions on the top, and then the pattern that can be seen as a cross, but also very embellished into other geometric forms with the cloisonné work and just once again, trying to show the status, the importance, the honor that is paid to the saint whose relics would be contained within. Another work of art that shows very, very high craftsmanship, just almost astonishingly high craftsmanship, is the Susanna Crystal. These are made in imitation of things like classical cameos. And there are several from the Carolingian period. This is probably the most noted one. It is 4.5 inches in diameter, and it is made out of engraved rock crystal. The mount that you see, the metal mount, is much later. They're not sure when that's dated. Estimates from the 15th to the 17th century. Now, as you can see, the crystal has been broken, they think in the 19th century. So sometimes it obscures a gesture or the inscription, but generally those can be reconstructed, or at least they have been. So we said this is the influence of classical cameos, which they did survive. Some of them survived to the present date, and the reason some of them survived is they would be mounted in Carolingian works of art, and sometimes later works of art, say in a cross or a book cover. The story that is told is in the Old Testament, in the Vulgate. I think it has probably been removed from some of the Protestant Bibles of the present day. So this is from the book of Daniel, the 13th chapter. And it tells the story of Susanna and the elders, and it shows Daniel's first appearance as a just judge. Now, in popular literature today, I have seen this in volumes of mysteries, and it's called like the first mystery story. And so we do have the first procedural mystery in the Bible. Here we just see some of the details, and we'll explain what these scenes are in a minute, but I want to talk about the style. And you know, when you think about how tiny these are and how much detail and how much emotion and activity are put in them, it is superb craftsmanship. It is wonderful work of art. The gestures are very lively. They're exaggerated. You sometimes have these large hands, so you can see exactly what the gesture is. The figures are often very active. They're little tubular bodies, little tubular legs and arms, and yet surrounded by drapery folds that wrap around them. And in some cases, you can see here the figure with this kind of jagged outline where the drapery is not forming a smooth outline, but a little jagged outline. And doesn't that remind you of the Utrecht Psalter, the influence of the Rheims manuscript style? Okay, let's look at this and go through the different scenes, and then we're going to talk about some possible interpretations. There is an inscription in the center section that goes around the circle in the center, and it translates as Lothar, king of the Franks, had this made. Which Lothar is a question. Most people believe that it is Lothar II, whose dates are 835 to 869. There is also an alternate theory that it is Lothar I, his father, but as Ginevra Kornbluth points out in one of her footnotes in an article, Lothar I rarely used the name King of the Franks. He was the emperor, so he usually had himself styled Augustus. Whereas his son, Lothar II, pretty much always used the title King of the Franks in his seals, on his documents, on his coins. So the weight seems to be that this is probably Lothar II. And so that's one way we're able to date it. It is in London in the British Museum. You can find it on their website. And so now we're going to look at the details and sort of tell the story. The first part of the story, we see Susanna in an enclosed garden, little architectural structure off to the side, which may represent her home or just a city, something like that. And you see the two elders twice. Once they're grabbing hold of this curving tree. Evidently they're going to scale the walls using the tree branches. And then we see them in the walled garden threatening Susanna. What are they threatening her with? Well, these people were the elders of the community. They have a very high position and social status. Sometimes in the book of Daniel they're called presbyters, which suggests a kind of ecclesiastical status as well. And yet, they spy on Susanna when she is bathing in the garden of her home. And they see her and they conceive great lust for her. And so they go to her and they say, lie with us, have sex with us. Or we will say that you had sex with somebody else, and we saw you. And the penalty for adultery for a woman was to be stoned to death. She would be killed. So, what they're doing is they're threatening to denounce her as an adulteress, even though she is innocent, and have her killed. So they're threatening her very life and reputation. What does Susanna do? Susanna screams. She calls for help, which is what you're supposed to do according to the Mosaic law if you are a woman in a city and you're being raped or threatened with rape. You call for help. She would rather die than give up her chastity. So the elders falsely accuse Susanna. Here you see them with their hands above her head, accusing her of adultery. The people are standing around in horror because Susanna was supposed to be this virtuous wife of a very prominent citizen, but they believe the elders. And so Susanna is led to execution. You see her sort of pulling back. It really is wonderful how the gestures and the poses really do tell the story. And as she's being led to execution, the Bible says that there is a young man that is there, his Daniel. It's Daniel's first activity as a judge. Now, in the Susanna Crystal, it's very interesting. He's not shown as a young boy, which we sometimes see in art. He's shown with a beard and with a longer garment that would speak of someone of a higher status, who was older. So more on that later. But at any rate, she meets Daniel. And Daniel stops the execution. Essentially, he says, wait, you haven't really examined the facts. And so he takes the two elders and examines them separately. Perhaps inspired by God, he's very suspicious of their story. And he says, now, where did you see her having sex with this young man? And one of them says that it's under a holm tree, and one of them says it's under a mastic tree. And since their stories do not jive, their stories are incompatible, realizes they're lying. This is the proof that they are lying. And so the elders are taken out and killed. Now, the book of Daniel just says they're killed, but in Numbers, I believe it is, they say that the penalty for false witness is death. And the penalty is death by stoning, so they are being stoned to death. This is justice. After all, this is what they would have done to Susanna. In fact, they would have done worse to her because they would not only have had her killed, but they would have had her reputation ruined. Everyone would have believed that she was an adulteress, even though she was innocent. And then in the center, you have an image, two men gesturing to her. Perhaps they've returned her to the judge. She's under a canopy. Her arms are raised in what was known as the orant position or the orans position. We saw this with early Christian art. The praying position, giving thanks with your arms upraised. And she's doing this before a judge. Now, what does this scene mean? When is this? Ginevra Kornbluth, who is the person who wrote the book on Carolingian gems and an article on the Susanna Crystal, and who is an online source for these images, these black and white images, she has an idea about this. She points out that the judge does not look like Daniel. He's clean shaven rather than the bearded Daniel. And she thinks that this scene, which is not in the Bible, is very important for the interpretation of the work of art, because it shows a step in the judicial process when the person who is innocent is vindicated, and she's been taken before the judge and she's been declared innocent. And so she's giving praise to God. Now, how do we interpret this? Why did the Why did the king have it made? We don't know what it was used for. It's quite large. One of the ideas it may have been embedded in something, anything from a throne to a very large brooch, if it were something like that. So we don't know the original function of it, but we do know something about the historical context and also how Susanna was interpreted. One of the ideas is that this has to do with the attempted divorce. Now, how do we interpret the Susanna Crystal? We don't know exactly how it was used. It's fairly large for a gemstone. It's 4.5 inches in diameter. It's 4.5 inches in diameter. So the suggestions about how it was used range from it was embedded in a throne or a book cover, or even worn as a particular large brooch. We don't know that. But how do we interpret why Lothar wanted to have this made? And many of the interpretations of the Susanna Crystal center around a historical event, Lothar's attempted divorce. And it was, if you think we have messy divorces now, this was particularly horrifying. He wanted a divorce from his wife, Tetburga, so he could marry the mother of his son, the mother of his mistress. However, at that time, both canon and civil law said that even if you got a divorce, you couldn't remarry unless the spouse had committed incest before the marriage, not adultery. They had to have committed incest. So, what did Lothar do? He accused his wife of incest with her brother before they were married. It was a particularly horrible situation. There were 2 bishops who examined Tetburga, and they promulgated their results, which they were not supposed to do, saying that she had confessed of incest. Whether she did or not, before and after, she denied it. So were they simply lying, or did she confess under torture? And that's what is often believed, that she may have been tortured. At any rate, there were various synods, there was various legal proceedings, and eventually the Pope just said, no, these charges are trumped up, they're not true, you must be reconciled with your wife, you have to take your wife back. He had sent her off to a convent, she had fled to Charles the Bald, Lothar's uncle, and there was a lot of politicking, because if Lothar died without issue, without a legitimate son, I should say, then his territory would be inherited by his uncles. So they had a vested interest in this as well. It was, as I say, pretty messy. The result was that the Pope ruled in Tetburga's favor. He said that Lothar must take back his wife and give her the full honors of being the wife of the king. And at least superficially, Lothar seemed to capitulate to what the Pope said. However, he did spend the rest of his life trying to get the divorce. He didn't live that much longer, only a few more years. So, people have said, well, this relates to the controversy over the divorce. Tetburga, like Susanna, was accused of sexual impropriety rather than adultery. She was accused of incest, and she was exonerated. The 2 elders were sometimes seen as related to these 2 bishops who got the spurious confession from Tetburga, possibly under torture, that they were acting against the law, they were acting improperly. They later were relieved of their office as bishop. They weren't killed, but they suffered career reversals, shall we say. So it's not exactly parallel, but there are some similarities. But why would Lothar have this created? Because it does put him in a bad light if that's your interpretation. Well, the suggestion was that this was a gift from Lothar to his wife after the Pope ordered the reconciliation, and it was sort of to show that he really was going to abide by the Pope's dictum. However, I suppose that's possible, but this is a very lavish gift, and we know that Lothar kept trying to get his divorce until his death. So you wonder. So let's look at some other interpretations. And I will tell you that I'm taking this from an article by Ginevra Kornbluth, which was published in the journal Gesta in 1992. And you can get this on the web. In fact, I'm putting a PowerPoint up of it on our website. Okay, so there are a number of things that Susanna Susanna appears in early Christian and in Carolingian literature. And by literature, I'm including theology, legal tracts, poetry, sermons. These are all sources that Kornbluth cited. And there's three ways that the Susanna story is used. And we can see that possibly all three of these are at least alluded to. One, Susanna is a symbol of the church, ecclesia. She suffers from persecution as the early church suffered from persecution. Two, Susanna is an example of chastity, and that's very, very clear. Kornbluth points out an interesting detail, that Susanna is shown in an enclosed garden with a fence around it. And the other images of Susanna from the early Christian period up through the Carolingian period do not show that enclosure. They might show some trees to say, okay, she's in an orchard, she's in a garden. But the enclosed garden was a symbol of chastity. It comes from Song of Solomon, where the bridegroom says, talks about my sister, my bride, in the hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden. As some of you may know later on, some of you may know this also is used later on as a symbol for Mary's virginity. But here is perhaps a reference to the chastity of Susanna. And then, Susanna is also an example of just judgment. And Kornbluth believes that all are alluded to, but the primary meaning of this has to do with judgment and judicial procedure. She points out that there's an emphasis on judicial procedure. There are scenes that are not actually shown in other images of Judith. The stoning of Judith being taken, for example, the accusation, Judith before the judge, Judith being taken to execution, the stoning of the elders. All of these show different steps in judicial procedure. Even the idea of David examining the elders separately. Now, this is a part of judicial procedure, and she points to a number of legal tracts of the time that speak out against unjust judgment and set down ways to get a true judgment. And these are things that you can see in the Susanna illustration, and that the Susanna story is used as an example by none other than Hincbar, the Archbishop of Reims, in judicial tracts that he wrote. So, in her interpretation, this is propaganda. She doesn't use that word, I'm using it. Propaganda for Lothar. It's showing himself as a just ruler. Now, we say, what? After what he did to his wife? Well, you know, she points out, and we can think of examples in present-day politics, where someone is accused of something, and they deny it, even if it's true. They may even get themselves to believe it, who knows. But they just say, they're virtuous, they are virtuous, don't attack me, I'm not guilty of this, somebody else is. So he is protesting that he is a just ruler. And even during the trial, even during the various machinations, the various things that were going on with the divorce, he kept saying, oh, I just want justice. And that does make a certain amount of sense, because Lothar is not going to have himself portrayed in a negative manner. He would want to show that he is a just ruler, a good ruler, both for his own self-image and for his, he wants his people to know it. We're going to show you one last very lavish work of art from the Carolingian period. This is the golden altar of St. Ambrose in the church of Sant Ambrogio in Milan. And there is an inscription on it that tells us who the patron is and who the artisan, the master craftsperson, who had been in charge of the design and creation of this work. His name was Wolvinius, and we'll show him in a moment. On the front side, we have this golden altarpiece with a cross shape with the center showing Christ in glory. I have a detail of that. And then on each side, 6 scenes from the life of Christ. Unfortunately, I don't have details of those. So here we're looking at the Christ in majesty, seated on a throne with a very elaborate jeweled halo. His knees seem to project forward. The draperies wrap the body. He has an elaborate footstool on which his feet rest. Now this would be created with the repoussoir technique. It is embellished with enamel and gems. And the artisans were presumably Italian, because this is from Milan, from the church of Sant Ambrogio. And we have to remember that northern Italy was part of the Carolingian Empire. So this would be considered to be Carolingian art, even if it's not up in Aachen or Tours or Reims or somewhere like that. The altar also has a back and sides, and this is the back of it, which is silver gilt. So you see the silver, and then you see the gilded images, and of course bejeweled as well. Here is the detail showing Wolvinus. His name in Italian is Wolvinio, and he is hunched over, he's bowing. He is showing homage to St. Ambrose, and of course it is St. Ambrose whose relics would be contained in this church, and also would be the titular saint of the church. St. Ambrose was the 4th century St. Ambrose was the 4th century bishop of Milan, and is considered to be one of the Latin doctors of the church. And you can see all of this beautiful enamel work. You can see the name of Wolvinius, and you may also be able to make out P-H-A-B-E-R. If you make the PH into an F, it may make a little more sense. Faber, maker. So it's defining him as the artist who created this. And then, of course, the saint's name is also represented here. Also, we have the image of the patron. Engelbrekt II, who was the Archbishop of Milan from 824 to 859, giving us dates for the altar. And here we see, once again, bowing over this sort of hunched position. Engelbrekt is offering the altar to St. Ambrose, and he is being blessed. Ambrose is reaching out and touching his forehead. He seems to be blessing and giving his authority to Engelbrekt.